A warehouse does not look like history. It looks like steel, concrete, and a few hundred feet of empty space under a high ceiling. But every one of these buildings sits at the end of a very long story, one that stretches back further than most people realize.
Before there were distribution centers, there were simply warehouses at the water's edge. In the 19th century, industrial cities built brick and timber storehouses beside rivers and rail yards, places where goods waited for the next leg of their journey. Ownership was local. A merchant owned the building his goods sat in, and that was the extent of the market.
The shift began with the shipping container. In the mid-20th century, standardized steel containers changed how goods moved between ship, rail, and truck. Buildings no longer needed to sit directly on a dock. They needed road access, height, and space to move pallets quickly. This is when the modern warehouse, as we understand it today, started to take shape. By the later decades of the 20th century, distribution had become its own industry, separate from manufacturing. Retailers wanted regional hubs. Manufacturers wanted buffer inventory close to their factories. And investors, for the first time, began to see these buildings not just as places to store goods, but as an asset class in their own right, something that could be bought, leased, and sold, much like an office tower or an apartment block. Then came the acceleration that defined this century. Online retail did not just add a new sales channel. It rewrote the geography of logistics real estate entirely. Suddenly, speed to the customer's door mattered as much as cost per square foot. Warehouses near ports, near highways, near dense urban populations became some of the most sought-after real estate on the planet, often trading at prices that would have seemed absurd a generation earlier. This history matters because it explains why warehouse acquisition today is treated as a specialized discipline, with its own language, its own risks, and its own way of separating a good deal from a costly mistake. So, what actually happens when an investor decides to buy one of these buildings? It begins, almost always, with sourcing. Deals reach an investor through brokers, direct owner relationships, or off-market introductions. At this stage, very little is confirmed. What exists is a location, a size, and an asking price. The investor's first task is simply deciding whether the building is worth a closer look at all. That first look focuses on physical specification, because in industrial real estate, the building's bones determine most of its long-term value. Clear height, the usable vertical space inside, tells you how much racking a tenant can install. Dock door ratio tells you how quickly trucks can load and unload. Column spacing determines how efficiently a tenant can organize their operations. And road access, often overlooked by newcomers, can be the single biggest driver of who will want to lease the building in the future. Once the physical building clears this first filter, the investor turns to the numbers, a process known as underwriting. At the center of underwriting sits one deceptively simple figure: net operating income, or the rent collected minus the operating costs of running the building. Divide that figure by the purchase price, and you arrive at the capitalization rate, or cap rate, the shorthand the entire industry uses to describe return. But a cap rate calculated on today's rent can be misleading, because it assumes today's rent continues indefinitely. A responsible investor asks a harder question: what happens to this income when the current lease ends? This is where lease review becomes critical. An investor examines the length of the remaining lease term, the tenant's history of paying rent on time, any renewal options the tenant holds, and the notice period required before those options must be exercised. A tenant with 2 years remaining and no history of financial strain represents a very different risk profile than a tenant with 2 months remaining and a shrinking footprint inside the building.
Tenant credit quality deserves its own moment of attention. A large, well-capitalized logistics operator paying rent on a 10-year lease is a fundamentally different asset than a small regional distributor on a short-term arrangement. Illustratively, if a building's income depends entirely on one tenant, that tenant's financial health becomes almost as important as the building's physical condition.
Once the lease is understood, the investor moves into due diligence, a structured investigation designed to surface anything the seller's marketing materials did not mention. This typically includes an environmental assessment, checking for soil or groundwater contamination from decades of industrial use. It includes a structural and mechanical inspection, checking the condition of the roof, the loading equipment, and any refrigeration or power systems. And it includes a title review, confirming that the seller actually owns what they claim to be selling, free of undisclosed liens or easements. It is often during due diligence that a deal's true risk profile becomes clear. A roof nearing the end of its serviceable life, an undisclosed easement limiting expansion, or a tenant quietly signaling they may not renew. These are the discoveries that separate an experienced investor from an eager one.
With diligence complete, negotiation begins in earnest. This is rarely just a conversation about price. Sophisticated buyers negotiate holdbacks for identified repairs, leasing reserves in case a tenant departs, extended diligence periods to investigate open questions, and representations from the seller about the building's condition and lease status. Financing runs in parallel with negotiation. Most acquisitions of this size involve institutional debt, and lenders apply their own underwriting standards, often more conservative than the buyer's own. A lender will typically size a loan around a debt service coverage ratio, ensuring the building's income comfortably exceeds the cost of the debt, even under a modestly stressed rent scenario. This is one of the reasons vacancy risk matters so much. A lender does not want to discover, after closing, that the income supporting the loan was never as secure as it appeared.
When negotiation, diligence, and financing align, the transaction moves to closing, the formal transfer of title, funds, and lease obligations. On paper, this is the end of the acquisition. In practice, it is only the beginning of the investor's real work.
Asset management follows immediately. This means monitoring the tenant's operational health, tracking lease expiry dates well in advance, maintaining the building's physical condition, and preparing for the eventual reality that every lease, no matter how strong, will one day end. A building that sits empty for 6 months while a new tenant is found can erase more value than years of steady cash flow can rebuild. Eventually, most acquisitions end in an exit, a sale to another investor, a refinancing, or a long-term hold passed to the next generation of ownership. The same principles that governed the purchase govern the sale. A building's value, in the end, is never just the rent it collects today. It is the durability of that rent, the quality of the physical asset underneath it, and the discipline of everyone who managed it along the way.
None of this guarantees a particular outcome. Every warehouse acquisition carries real risk: vacancy, market oversupply,
environmental liability, financing costs, and simple bad timing. No cap rate, no matter how attractive, removes that risk. It only prices it if the investor is honest enough to look for it. This is the discipline behind every industrial real estate deal, whether it happened a century ago beside a river dock or happens this year beside a highway interchange. The buildings change. The underlying questions do not. This is Trov Estate. Every deal has a history behind it and a discipline underneath it. Understand both before you sign.